Hello and welcome to Roundtable. More and more walls are being built on the borders of Europe. Does it make sense to keep out those who are not wanted, or do these barriers lead to a rise in persecution? Between the fall of the Berlin Wall and 2018, EU countries erected more than 1,000 kilometers of new walls, and constructors are busy at it today. It's been called Fortress Europe. Good to have you along. I'm David Foster. What happened in Syria, what is happening right now in Afghanistan, the rise in migrants. Is there a better way to treat those who want new lives? Border barriers are rising across Europe. Lithuania and Poland have announced that they will build their own on the border with Belarus. Both nations have reported a sharp increase in migrants, particularly from Iraq and Afghanistan. Greece has finished a 40-kilometre fence on its border with Turkey. Surveillance systems have also been installed as Greek ministers say they will turn back refugees.
We examined ways to enhance surveillance and protection systems. And I need to say that Greece continues to shield itself against any potential or existing threat against its security.
Concerns about migration have increased in Europe as Afghan refugees scramble to flee their country following the Taliban takeover. European leaders fear a migration crisis similar to that of 2015, when more than 1 million refugees and migrants entered the continent. Without a unified EU plan, will European countries continue to unilaterally build more walls? Can border walls stop migration? We go first of all to Kiel in Germany and say hello to Professor Matthias Lucke, coordinator of Mercator Dialogue on Asylum and Migration in Europe. Then to New York, Upper New York State on the East Coast, and we see Eleanor Paynter, Migration Fellow at Cornell University. Back across the Atlantic, and there in Rome is Giovanni Fontana, president of Second Tree, a group working with refugees in northern Greece. I'll come to you in a little while, Giovanni, if I may. I know you're not in Greece at the moment, obviously, but you're still talking to people up there. We'll try and get your assessment of what's happening on the ground. But this question is really for all three of you. I will start with you, Matthias, if I may. Do border walls work?
Well, they do have the effect of reducing the number of people who cross borders. At least border walls are part of a policy. And we know from the literature and from a lot of research in migration economics that policies do affect migrant flows. So yes, in that sense, border walls work.
But do they work?
Whether we like the intended effect may be a different matter.
Do they work just by keeping people out, or by providing a disincentive to do something that could be dangerous?
Probably both. They keep people where they are, and they also force people to choose alternative routes. So both these things happen. But those who set up a border wall will see the effect of seeing less people come to their country.
Okay, I'll come to you in just a moment, if I may, Matthias, again about the number of migrants in Europe actually falling and whether this is one of the reasons. But Eleanor, let me ask you this. Is there another reason why border walls are put up? Is it to show your population, your voters, that you are doing to some extent what they might like to see you do?
Well, to answer the question whether border walls work is really depends on what you want to accomplish with the wall. And walls serve, of course, this immediate purpose of bringing a halt to entries, but they are especially effective in their symbolic value. So I think it's really important when we talk about border walls to talk also about how connected they are to the message that migrants aren't welcome, foreigners aren't welcome. And so when we think about issues immediately at Europe's borders, those are also really intimately connected to issues facing people who have already arrived, communities within Europe. And I also think that the question of whether walls work sort of shifts the focus away from what we could view as a more fundamental question about what happens to people's rights in those situations. So we do know that they stall migrations or reroute people, but people keep moving, or they end up in periods of unextended limbo. And we know that the effects of walls include that people are migrants, are put in situations of extreme precarity and suffering. So think about the pushbacks that have continued to happen even in recent weeks along the Balkan route for Afghans, for example. And I think that walls also enable countries to do what we think of as weaponizing border spaces and migrants. In other words, they are part of a larger system of policies and practices through which governments use migrants as a kind of political tool or a threat even. You can think of when Turkey threatened to bus migrants to the Greek border, and we've seen this happening in several different places around Europe in recent years.
Take a look at this razor wire here. I would imagine if I was confronted by that, I would be very frightened. I might be tempted to take a more dangerous route to try and get into Europe rather than to try and get here. Would it be fair to say that they actually direct people, push them away from the border into situations that could be more precarious?
Absolutely. Although we also see that people continue to try to cross. So people they say that they play the game, for example, at the Bosnian border, trying to cross repeatedly. But also it's true that, even though entries have decreased in recent years, we've seen, for example, in the Mediterranean Sea, that the rate of death and drowning has continued to remain high.
Let's take a look at this because, of course, border walls are nothing new. I mean, you can go back millennia and you'll find that barriers have been erected. 60% of the world's population now in a country with a border wall. 56% of that's in Asia, 26% in Europe, the continent we're talking about, and 16% in Africa, which has the longest border wall, Morocco, Western Sahara. Giovanni, let's come to you in Greece. What is actually happening physically on the ground with the construction process?
Well, I would say Greece is quite a different situation compared to other countries because there is a land border with Turkey, but there's also a sea border, which was the one that has been used by the most part of the migrants for many years. Then the control on that border has been strengthened continuously, and as Professor Paynter was saying, like migration routes are rerouted. I would also add that not only it makes migration more difficult, but it makes it more expensive. So in terms of limiting people movement, it's for sure that some people or a share of people will not be able to afford the trip, either because they don't want to run the risk or because they don't have the money to buy a passport, or they don't have the money to get connected to the right smuggler, who is the one that knows how to corrupt the border patrol person at the Everest border. So basically what has been happening on the ground is the immediate effect of the policies that basically Europe has been practicing for the last 5 or 6 years. And we see the impact immediately, like now in Afghanistan, with the surge of the Taliban. We know that in a couple of months, people will be knocking at our doors and the doors will be closed because there's barbed wire and Coast Guards stopping them.
And the barbed wire, the actual physical wall that you see when you go to the areas which house the migrants with whom you are dealing, can you give us an idea of what it looks like, how big it is, how intimidating perhaps it is?
Well, the issue with the border between Greece and Turkey is that most of that area was a military area already. It's a border on a river. In itself, I would say that the border, that wall, the one that has been built and proclaimed finished now, it's much more of a symbolic measure because most of the crossing between Turkey and Greece still happen by sea. You know very well that the Greek islands are really one gaze away from the Turkish coast. But it's, of course, a symbolic message. You were mentioning earlier what Mitsotakis said, like the foreign minister of Turkey, of Greece. It's more of a symbolic message that says you're not welcome, and we will try to do anything possible for you not to be able to reach Europe. Because when you're in Europe, then you can claim asylum and we cannot send you back.
Matthias, let's hear from Notice Mitteraki, who's the Greece migration minister.
We don't want to be the gateway to Europe for the smuggling networks. We don't want to be the gateway for millions of people to enter the European Union through Greece and end up in all the member states of the European Union.
Matthias, when he says we don't want them to enter all the member states of the European Union, is that just sort of trying to look good? Is this all about Greece rather than the big bloc?
Well, it depends very much on what would be happening at the northern border of Greece. As long as there was a Balkan route, many migrants would actually continue on to Central Europe. And this, of course, is being prevented by the border wall that Greece is maintaining at its border with Turkey.
I suppose what I'm trying to get at is he being altruistic and saying we're doing this for the good of everybody, or is he actually cloaking a desire to be simply good for his own country by saying the right thing? And if so, how much is that reflected in all the member states?
Well, I think there is an understanding that Greece should not be left alone by the rest of the European Union if Greece indeed had a large in-movement of migrants. And in that sense, indeed, the whole of the European Union would be affected. So in that sense, the whole of the European Union benefits from Greece deterring entry of irregular migrants, even if that means precluding them from applying for asylum, which legally they ought to be able to do.
These wars are symbolic, as has been suggested in this program. I'm wondering how much has changed since 2015, when there was a massive influx of refugees and migrants, a lot of them from Syria. How much has the European approach changed? Because something was talked about called the European Migration Pact. Again, I'm wondering if, in fact, that was just hot air, the right thing to say. Because if migration numbers have gone down, is it because of that, or is it because of another reason?
Well, I think a lot of things happened after 2015. We had the agreement with Turkey, which provided for a lot of support for refugees in Turkey from the European Union. At the same time, of course, Turkey had its border wall with Syria, so more Syrians could not actually come from Syria to Turkey. Then those people who made it to Greece and tried to move on to Central Europe would have been stopped on the Western Balkans because the Western Balkan route was closed at the same time. And then, of course, those who made it from Turkey to the Greek islands would have been stuck in places like Moria, where living conditions were really precarious and there was little perspective of completing asylum procedures and moving on. So all these things taken together. And I think importantly, the fact that living conditions for refugees in Turkey did improve as a result of the agreement with the EU. All of this together helped to reduce the number of migrants that came to Europe.
Eleanor, I'm casting my mind back, not personally, but historically, a couple of centuries, maybe a little bit longer, to when people fleeing persecution in Europe arrived on the continent where you are right now. What does it say about Europe right now that it's being suggested that those equally fleeing persecution are finding many more difficulties and obstacles put in their path than those who went on the Mayflower more than 2 centuries ago?
That's such an important question. And again, I think it brings to the fore the fact that we have to think about how connected all of these border and migration issues are with questions of xenophobia, anti-immigrant racism, and certainly, I think in Europe, what we've seen over the last few years is part of a longer continuum. So it's not just that over the last couple of years, they've toughened policies or tried to close borders, but that's part of a longer continuum of securitization and militarization of the borders. And as you all were just saying, one of the things that happens in those circumstances is that people who should be able to file an asylum claim are unable to do so. So to take one example, what we've seen happen in the central Mediterranean over the last 6 or 7 years is a shift from prioritizing search and rescue to criminalizing rescue. And in fact, leaving people stranded at sea and governments knowingly leaving people in these border spaces unable to exercise their rights. So that is certainly sending a strong message about a particular set of values that unfortunately doesn't recognize the value of migration and recognizing people's rights.
Which sort of leads me to the big question. What will it take for these walls to come down? Because many people didn't think the Berlin Wall would ever do so, but in 1989 it did. And when I was looking at the razor wire, I was reminded of standing on the East-West German border and seeing just that. It's not there anymore. What will it take for these barriers to be removed?
I'm afraid that before we see barriers like this being removed, we're going to see many more kinds of barriers like this going up, as we're also seeing still, in conversation in the US, for example. So I think this is also part of a global trend. And when we think about barriers, we can talk about the physical barriers, but of course, as I just mentioned with the Mediterranean, there are all kinds of surveillance forms and other ways that people are, quote unquote, protecting or surveilling their borders that function effectively as walls as well. And so I think that's a massive global industry, border security is, and it's growing. And there's a lot of political momentum behind it right now. If the European Union could come to a firm, more solid agreement for a fair and just way to process asylum applications, to help migrants settle into the European Union, then we might be able to finally move past what has been for years an emphasis on migration as crisis. And one of the problems with that is that it positions migrants as a threat. And so there aren't ways to think about migration in the long term.
Yeah, but you see, the issue with this, I think, sorry for interrupting, is that while you may say all the right things, not you personally, but European Union members may agree entirely with what you say about a rethink on this and that. When they see the migration numbers falling, when they see the fact that these border walls are effective, they are not going to say, we will tear them down. They will say, OK, well, look, let's work on a better policy. But in the meantime, they stay.
In that case, I think it depends a lot on what happens with civil society actors and groups that are really advocating and working for migrant rights. I'm so glad that we have Giovanni Fontana on the program, groups like his and groups like Alarm Phone, who are documenting rights violations, trying to support migrant aid organizations, and also hold governments accountable for the violence that's enacted with these walls and policies. Hopefully would be able to move people towards a shift and move public discourse towards challenging these walls and these violent policies.
OK, you've mentioned the fact that you think, Eleanor, more and more walls will be built. Let's go to you, Giovanni. But before we hear from you, let's pull up this graphic on what's happening, just a small little bit of what's happening in Europe at the moment. The Greek 40-kilometre fence on its border with Turkey, surveillance, we've mentioned that, now worried about Afghan refugees perhaps trying to reach Europe after the Taliban takeover. Poland, along its 400-kilometre border with Belarus, 2.5 meters high. And in Lithuania, 500-plus kilometers again on the border with Belarus after the Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko's threat to flood Europe with migrants because he's been hit with some sanctions. You think, I know, Giovanni, that there will be more walls. So what do you think is going to happen in the longer term? Excuse me.
Well, I like the question on what can Europe do for more borders not to go up and more walls not to go up is very simple in theory and very difficult in practice. It would require just a shift in public opinion. Like it's our responsibility. I say our as a European citizen, and to verify this, you can just follow the money. Like Frontex, like the border agency of the European Union, was started in 2006 with a budget of 6 million euros. It has a budget, a budget for 2027 of 300 times more, 1.8 billion of euros. That is where Europe is putting money, closing borders. Same thing for like this, the budgeted year of 2021, 2027 is the first time that Europe puts more money in Frontex borders than in AMIF, which is the Fund for Integration. And I'm sorry to mention all of these numbers, but that is what counts. We as European citizens vote for parties that support stopping migration. This is not an emergency. It's not an economic crisis. This is a crisis of value.
But let me get back to the point I made to Eleanor. If migration numbers have fallen at the same time as border walls are going up, and if not everybody feels the same as you, they're quite happy to see migration numbers slow down, if not ended, then there's no incentive whatsoever from the authorities to stop building these walls.
What I would say is that groups, organizations like mine what they can do, and maybe there is some degree of self-criticism in what I'm saying, try to tell the story of refugees not only, because of course, the counter-narrative of seeing refugees as invaders is very present, but also seeing refugees as only victims presents the problem that the public opinion in Europe might think, well, we need to help them. And we should tell stories, we should explain how economically, in principle, for values like migration enriches European countries. And so trying to explain to the public opinion, look, Europe is getting older, social security, pensions, healthcare, these are really expensive things. We need migrants to contribute to our economies. It's in our interest to help them. And maybe this is the only shift that can have people really support more people coming in. Because, when people are in Europe, for the most part, they go to the same shop, they interact with each other. In Greece, they have this Italian saying, una faccia, una razza, which means one face, one race, like everyone has this approach. And when people interact with each other, it's much more difficult to steer fire on these narratives. But of course, when you build walls, when you strengthen the borders, that cannot happen. But, focusing as we should do on how convenient for Europe, not only right ethically, but how convenient it is for the European continent to have more migrants, that could be a change in narrative.
But rather difficult, Matthias, I'll come to you, not to see them sometimes as victims when they're fleeing persecution, for a start. And secondly, when there seems to be a wave of anti-migrant sentiment in a number of European countries, most notably a couple that are very close to these borders. It's going to be difficult to shift that kind of opinion.
I think the issue is a little more difficult than Giovanni made it out, because the people that can integrate well into European labor markets would have to be quite well trained. And a lot of people that are coming as refugees don't have that sort of training. So hosting them, receiving them, hosting them is really a humanitarian responsibility. But it's frankly not the case that these people will end up paying for my pension when I retire in a few years. We know that from the inflow of refugees in 2015 and how difficult it has been to integrate them into the labor market, even though a lot of effort has been made for that, in Germany certainly, where we've been watching that.
Have you got any way of assessing whether in fact they've been a net gain or a net burden across Europe or in Germany, where you happen to be, those that have arrived since 2015, even given the difficulties?
Oh, my take is it's clearly a net fiscal cost. So it's a humanitarian responsibility, and it's costing us something. And overall, we are a rich country, so we can afford it. So it's the right thing to do, and we can easily afford it. But I think that there has been a net cost, and arguing that there would have been, that these refugees were a net benefit to European residents, I think is unhelpful, because it's not true when people understand it's not true.
But perhaps even if it's a net cost at the moment, you could put the argument that in the longer term there's going to be a net gain. Is promising jam tomorrow rather difficult when people want their answers today?
Well, I was even thinking of economic simulation exercises that basically cover the whole lifetime of the refugees. So the point is that even if they do work, they will not be able to earn enough to get a decent pension, which means they will be supported when there is a welfare state. They will be supported by the welfare state in their old age, and that basically is the main mechanism.
Okay.
Why at the end of the day there's a fiscal cost, and yes, there's humanitarian responsibility.
Eleanor, if you could sum something up in a very short space of time, would it be that you think some migrants may well look at what we see behind me, the razor wire, the cameras, the surveillance, the heavily armed people, and think, actually, it just isn't worth it. I'd be better off where I came from?
I think that's a very difficult claim to make, especially when you consider that people are arriving at these borders, having traveled for weeks, months. Sometimes people have been traveling for years, depending on the situations from which they were displaced. So no, I think while they might be, again, rerouted or stalled, put in a precarious limbo, it's unlikely that that's going to deter people. They're looking for a way to seek protection.
Listen, thank you very, very much indeed. Giovanni, good luck with your work on the ground up in northern Greece. Appreciate you taking the time. Eleanor from upstate New York, which looks absolutely stunning at the moment. And Matthias, thank you very much indeed for being on this round table. What we need to do, it might appear, is bring down the walls between people rather than the walls on the border, or perhaps the two things will happen together in the long term. For me, David Foster from the Roundtable team, thank you very much for watching this program. We hope to have you with us on another occasion. Until then, goodbye.